I don't know. Whenever I do presentation prep, it just sort of becomes a brain train of thought that I'm thinking at that moment or that week. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what I'm going to be talking about.
Yeah, Joff is basically InfoSec turrets. It is basically what this is. So with a really cool Australian accent. So.
Yeah, and I mean, EDR is a big topic, right? You see everyone jumping into it like it's the next hot thing.
So I got a question for you, George. So this is something we're wrestling with, and I'd love to get the kind of feedback on Discord. But whenever we're talking adversary like emulation, attack emulation, simulation, whatever, is it essential for these tools to actually bypass these EDR products, or is that kind of defeating the point of kind of an assumed point and testing what happens next? Because it seems like a lot of our customers are split. Some are very much like, no, assumed compromise. We'll put it into logging, non-blocking mode. It's good. And then you have other people that are like, no. If you're emulating an adversary, you gotta bypass it, and that's a tough game.
Yeah, so what we do is we go in and based on how they are and their maturity level, right? A lot of the times we're brought in when they're evaluating a new EDR and they want to test this in a lab environment. I'm like, no. See, in the lab environment, you're going to turn everything on. Of course, it's going to catch everything. But you actually need to put this in production. And when you turn everything on, you're going to realize that a lot of real production workloads are going to be caught as malicious. So you need to start that tuning process and then introduce the adversary emulation and really bringing in the attack chains, right? Because I always use like who am I and IP config and like these very simple things that anyone can do, but normally it does not happen in succession, right?
One of my favorite things ever in the earlier versions of the Mitre attack framework, they list out the attacker tools that they used, and I swear to God, one of the earliest editions, they actually said attackers use ping. And it was like,
we should ban ping.
We should ban ping. That's crazy. So
it's a really good conversation to have, because I think what I'm about to present is really going to illustrate a lot of that point, right? Because recently, as John was just alluding to, we have been struggling with this issue, whether we come in really very stealthily, we come in, try to defeat, bypass EDR and so forth, or whether we just come in with a standard playbook and let what happen is going to happen. I tend to fall to both. I come in quiet when I feel like I've got enough traction, when I've got far enough, start turning up the noise dials and seeing how much they're going to pick up. But it's a tough issue, and a lot of what I'm about to talk about is really more about the coming in from the quieter side and not triggering as much in the terms of the instrumentation in the environment. So,
all right, and once again, I think that's critical. That we if you're a tester, if you're doing emulation, you need to have that skill. Otherwise, people stop believing that attackers can bypass these EDR products, and they start putting way too much faith into it. So with that, Joff, you ready to take it away?
I think we're right up on top of the hour. Sounds like a good plan to me. All right, so let's get that up on the screen. Hopefully everybody can see the screen, and we have a title slide up.
Yep.
All right, so here we are, 2 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to be presenting on attack emulation in the age of EDR and talk a little bit about some of the C2 pivot / assumed compromise tactics that I take during my day-to-day pen testing. Who am I? I'm this Joff guy. I thought it'd be really cool to go into Google Slides and play with their little paint program and see what it could do. So I've gone negative. And of course, being a lead up to election time, why not go negative, right? Okay, enough about that. Yeah, I do malware dev, research and pen testing for Black Hills. I do teach SEC 573, which is automating information security with Python for the SANS Institute. I'm also doing a Security Weekly podcast on a regular basis, hopefully be doing that tonight. And, so many other things. I like writing software that does interesting things in terms of my attacking networks perspective. So that's a lot what we're going to be talking about right now. As pen testers, of course, we want to emulate threat actors as realistically as possible. One of our goals is to demonstrate risks through the emulation of threat actors, right? We've got to have real and actionable value at a reasonable cost. This is the whole game that we're looking at, and this is the whole reason that we come around to the types of engagements that we've been talking about today, which is emulating threat actors. Pen testing companies have a great buffet of good things to choose from. There are many things on offer. Black Hills Information Security is no exception, as are many of our other friends. Red teaming, we've got something we call black teaming as well. Internal and external network testing, web apps, more focused testing on mobile apps, purple teaming. And then what we're really going to talk about today more so is this concept of assumed compromise testing. Sometimes we've called that a C2 pivot as well, which stands for command and control, data exfiltration, and lateral movement. This is the space where I want to focus today, because this is when we are emulating the insider attack threat. Defenders definitely need a way to tune their skills, their tools, their tactics, procedures. We can take either a cooperative or a competitive approach, right? I always think a competitive approach is more akin to red teaming. It's more that unannounced engagement where we are going to be contracted to come at your organization without you knowing the specific time frame. We're probably going to have a longer duration engagement. We are not limiting our activities necessarily to the virtual domain or the software domain, the server and client endpoint domain. We could engage with you in a physical sense to try and penetrate your network or your organization and get away with all kinds of interesting things. This is not what I'm going to talk about today. I really want to talk more about a cooperative engagement. Boy, that's a hard word to say. Often presented as purple teaming or assumed compromise testing. More of the scoped insider threat exercise. In other words, this real-world attacker tactics to gain privilege, to laterally move, to access sensitive data and exfiltrate that data, and to test the organization's defenses in terms of what you can and will detect during those activities. So how do we go about doing this? Well, the first thing we need to do is, usually, you don't have to do this, but usually it makes more business sense to take away the social engineering aspect and position a pen tester on a workstation asset of some sort inside the organization as a standard employee. Provision them an account that puts them in HR or puts them into accounting or puts them into engineering, something that is a normal role in that organization. And most of the time, when we are doing that, we're going to be placed onto a Windows endpoint quite typically. Not always, but that's very typical. So we're dealing with Windows 10 endpoints a lot today. We want to have the pen tester work towards achieving privilege escalation, followed by some sort of lateral movement and sensitive data access, and then to demonstrate the things that have been performed during that period of testing, and where possible, get the feedback from the organization that's being tested that indicates the IOCs, the defensive alerts that correlate and correspond with all those testing activities. And in our reporting, we can actually line those things up from a time frame perspective so that the organization knows when we were attacking, what tactics we were used, and what were the defensive indicators that they received during that period of time. Additionally, and this is sometimes a difficult point for organizations to come to terms with, we really want to communicate openly, transparently with the defense team with respect to the tools, tactics, and procedures. We want to be an open book. We want them to understand that, yes, we tried to just password spray their organization, and did you detect it? It was done at this date and time specifically, and 5 more times on these other dates. So we definitely want to do this in such a fashion that they can measure and respond. Now, on the responding side, we need to be a little bit careful that the defense does not block our attempts. One of the things that we like to say when we're performing these assumed compromised exercises is set an understanding with the customer that, yes, you are to tell me when you are seeing my activities, but for the sake of the continuation of the exercise, please don't actually perform blocking activities. Don't throw me off the network. Don't quarantine my workstation, because if you do, then we are just going to cease testing, and you're not really going to get the value for the money that you're looking for. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't point out Mitre attack. We've just talked about it, well, pretty much all day since noon anyway. And, you know, honestly, I can't say enough good things about what Mitre has done for the industry with the attack matrix. We have here something that is fast becoming a standard in the industry. It's a taxonomy from the adversarial point of view. It describes how threat actors can penetrate networks, escalate privileges, move laterally, evade defenses. It gives us a way to actually tie all of the tactics that somebody like myself is going to employ and the defenses to specific taxonomy, to specific terms and pointers inside those matrices, which are really a very, very useful framework. It gives us a common language, right? We've been executing assumed compromise engagements for a number of years at Black Hills. We have also, some of you may remember that Black Hills engaged quite a lot in doing an annual, I forgot what we called them now, annual cash cow tipping exercise. And we challenged, frankly, a lot of security vendors in those exercises to step up the game. We said to the defense industry, please do better. Well, they did. And in the last 5 to 7 years that I've been working in the industry, we have seen a lot of new paradigms and technologies be introduced. Proactive threat hunting and hunt teaming, right? User behavior analytics and the associated cloud technologies required to actually execute the data analysis required. Endpoint detection and products have emerged with great accuracy at detecting activities. Network instrumentation and detection has improved radically, and more environments that we are testing today actually are implementing app whitelisting and doing it very effectively. So what does this mean to us? It means to us as testers that we have to step up the game significantly. Windows. Microsoft Windows 10 is better secured than any prior release. So much so that many people, you know, there used to be kind of an attitude in the pen testing industry that, oh, I don't want my primary desktop to be a Windows system. I mean, come on, guys, it's Windows, right? And Microsoft, I'm not trying to hurt you here. It's just there was sort of this assumption that why would you do that? I truly believe that assumption has turned around, and there are a lot of industry information security professionals that are pretty impressed with what Microsoft is doing with Windows 10, and it is much better secured than prior releases. Now, does that mean it's any less of a target? No. Windows is certainly a target. It's still the de facto endpoint for business operations that people are targeting for attacks, but they have matured considerably. Things like AppGuard, CredGuard, PowerShell's transcription, script block, and module logging, right? Constrained language mode. Our friend AMSI to help defend against scripting language exploitation. Lots of really good things. So when we come to doing the tests that Black Hills involves itself with a lot, we do tend to run into pretty sophisticated and capable organizations. We do tend to run into folks with a pretty good security operations budget and resources that are leveraging best of breed technologies. It's not uncommon in my testing for me to encounter strong and manually tuned antivirus solutions. Things like Carbon Black Bit9 or App Locker whitelisting, things like Cylance, Sentinel-1, CrowdStrike Falcon. The solutions that work pretty well if they are well implemented and well tuned. So for the remainder of the slides, I'm going to put myself in the context of dealing with these sorts of organizations and talk about the kind of tactics that I have to take in response to a pretty well-tuned environment. I'm also going to try to map it to Mitre wherever I can. So for initial C2 channel execution, this is always the number one step. I'm in the insider environment. I may be shipped a laptop. I may have some sort of virtual access to that environment via a VPN and remote desktop protocol. Most of the time, what I want to do as soon as I get my hands on that system is establish a strong C2 channel presence so that I have the ability to interact with that system across my C2 channel instead of directly on the endpoint. Now, why is that? Well, if we are talking about the context of a well-secured environment, more than likely the following will apply. You will not be able to run executables. Visual Basic Script will not run, C script, W script, for example. PowerShell will be heavily monitored with module logging and transcription, possibly. That's in a really paranoid environment. And certainly with script lock logging. The endpoint will be forwarding event information. The egress traffic will be filtered heavily. In fact, most of the organizations that I test, believe it or not, the only internet communications that you will be able to perform from that system is going to be via a web proxy. And in some cases, they're even man-in-the-middling the TLS traffic, right? Or machine in the middle, like taking apart that TLS connection. Some cases, not all. So we immediately put ourselves into the situation of having to live off the land. Now, my favorite thing to do is live off the land with the .NET framework. If you're in a Windows 10 world, you're going to have .NET on that system, and you're going to be probably in a .NET 4.6 kind of environment or later, okay? So with a little bit of programming, you have the capability in hand as an attacker to use things like InstallUtil, MS-Build, CSC, RegAsm, all of these live off the land tools to get your command channel to execute, because you cannot execute a standard executable, right? You have to bypass the application whitelisting. Now, what does it look like from a Mitre perspective? I came up with a new cheesy term here. I call it my Mitre attack tactical stack. What I did was I went into the Mitre attack framework, and I was like, well, for every technique I'm going to talk about, let me just pull out the actual tactic and the technique associated with it and just put it into one little spreadsheet table, and then I can point it out as I'm going through each slide. And I thought it was actually a cool idea. I don't know if anybody else does. So what we're talking about here in terms of that initial C2 channel is how can we not only get it to execute, but can we evade those defenses immediately? So we're talking about both the tactics of execution and defense evasion. We're talking about signed binary proxy execution as a tactic, and then a sub-tactic might be a compiled HTA, InstallUtil, MSHTA, any of these other things that I've mentioned here. So with .NET, we have all these options available to us. Without .NET, well, we're sort of left with perhaps run DLL32.exe and generating traditional DLLs instead of dealing in the .NET space and trying to get those into memory, okay? In terms of the traffic, my favorite thing to do today is to use one of the CDNs, right? To use one of the big content providers and drive that HTTP TLS channel straight back through the CDN. I want to blend in. So what I'll typically do is go to AWS, create a CloudFront distribution, just use CloudFront's TLS certificate. I don't even bother creating a unique domain, and make sure that the origin traffic goes back to my C2 infrastructure. My C2 infrastructure can either be something like a Metasploit listener running a HTTPS, a TLS payload from Interpreter, or it can be Cobalt Strike. And these days, more and more, I tend to be using Cobalt Strike. But honestly, it doesn't matter as long as you can establish that C2 channel. The other big tip when you're in the world of EDR and sophisticated, well-tuned antivirus, do not use a staged payload. You will not succeed. Your second stage coming in over the network is going to get busted every single time. There is just no way that you're going to get there in those kinds of well-tuned environments. So set up your Cobalt Strike or your Metasploit, set it up so it is a stageless origin to receive that TLS traffic from the content distribution network and generate your shell code to be carried in whatever delivery mechanism as a stageless shell code. So there is no second stage to establish your C2 channel. Okay. The other important point here, if you're not using reverse TCP, as I have in this case, if you're using HTTPS, then you're generating your stageless listener. Make sure on the back end that that thing has got a proper signed certificate. Of course, if it's going through CloudFront, that's less of an issue because that will be a proper signed certificate from CloudFront. Okay. If you're in Cobalt Strike and you want to generate some stageless shellcode, you have limited options right now in the default framework, but a very simple aggressor script can help you actually generate stageless shellcode. And this is that script exactly. It adds a menu to Cobalt Strike. It gives you two options to generate either x64 or x86 payloads, and then it simply iterates through any of your stageless listeners and generates the appropriate shellcode. It puts an XOR encoder on the shellcode and allows you to save it to a file. So it's pretty easy to set up. Now, how about delivering the shellcode? Well, let's imagine for a minute that you're going to use InstallUtil. InstallUtil is simply a .NET installation program that allows you to run essentially a method inside of a DLL. This is all you need in C# to actually deliver shellcode directly from an InstallUtil compiled DLL, right? So what I've done here is I have the uninstall method sitting here as uninstall that you can see here, public override void uninstall. I'm using virtual alloc to allocate some memory. I'm copying the shellcode into that memory, and then I am creating a function pointer directly to that shellcode and then invoking that function pointer. And what do you know? You have an executing shellcode. In order to compile this thing, set it to active release. Make sure that you add in the reference for system configuration install.dll. Compile it as x64 if you want it in x64 or x86 if you want it there. Pick your platform. I usually go with 64-bit because most people are going to have that on the endpoint. And then you can load up that DLL or run it. Now, I put the PowerShell load assembly option here just so that you can see there are different ways to do this. Once I have compiled that .NET standard project down to a DLL assembly, I can very easily jump into PowerShell, use system.reflection.assembly, load that assembly, and then create an instance of the object. In this case, I called it Pittsburgh.section, just random English words, and then execute a method, and then I have my command channel shellcode in memory. Now, if you don't want to do this from PowerShell, you can also use InstallUtil. Because you have this install method up here in your code, InstallUtil with the uninstall flag will execute this code here that you've created, and equivalently, you can get that shellcode into memory. So, with the initial C2 channel, you may cause some sort of minimal IOC, right? If you run something like MS Build, if you run something like InstallUtil, if you do the PowerShell activities that I had on the prior slide, you will probably create some initial indicator of compromise for the environment to look at. And they will probably call you and go, I see this. But you're just establishing an initial C2 channel. After you get that initial C2 channel established, then you get to go to work. And what I like to do for my Recon discovery phase is actually to start leaning more and more on things like .NET assemblies that I can execute through the C2 channel and or proxy some sort of script through the C2 channel rather than executing the actual technique on the endpoint itself. And the reason for that is, again, defense evasion, right? So some tools that exist out there, PowerSploit, obviously, in PowerShell form. Seatbelt is a great recon tool to learn a lot about the environment that is in a .NET assembly form. If you're in Cobalt Strike, for example, you can execute an assembly directly from the Cobalt Strike console. Sharp shares is another one, direct DLL assembly form or executable in assembly form that you can execute. So it's much nicer to do that inside the C2 channel code than to actually branch out with a PowerShell on the endpoint, causing lots of indicators of compromise and potential logging events. If you keep it inside the C2 channel, you're going to do better. You're going to make the defenders work a little harder. Okay. So executing DLL assemblies via the C2 channel, also using a SOX proxy and executing techniques across a SOX proxy or an HTTP proxy if you want in Metasploit or Cobalt Strike. Either way, doesn't matter, is going to work. So for example, there are lots of useful recon and discovery tools, things like Bloodhound, Impacket, ADI, DNS dump. A lot of these things run on Kali Linux or any generic Linux system, and we can proxy that traffic through the SOX proxy that we set up in our C2 infrastructure and essentially avoid EDR. So it's not going to be a problem. They're going to have to focus in the environment more on the traffic that is coming from the endpoint. So the proxy traffic that's going to come through is going to be all of the LDAP ADSI traffic. It's going to be all the SMB and RPC and DNS traffic, but you are not going to have indicators of compromise coming from the endpoint itself. Essentially, you are walking around the EDR in this fashion, right? Now, if you look at it from the Mitre a tactical stack point of view, again, Joff's kind of words there, Mitre attack, tactical stack, that's kind of a mouthful. I was never really good at selling things, so you're going to have to give me a break on that, right? But we are talking about account trust discovery. We're talking about permission groups discovery, process discovery, registry information, software discovery, all of the things that you need to know about that environment to get you further from the perspective of gaining access to privileged, gaining access to sensitive data, escalating privileges, and laterally moving. Right? Bloodhound, for example, can present a lot of network traffic, especially if you collect session information. Something you can do with Bloodhound is limited it just to domain information relationships initially. In other words, steer the traffic just to the domain controllers. So in this example, I've got a Cobalt Strike console up, and I've got one beacon C2 channel that is executing from my development system, and I started a SOX proxy. So SOX on port 9090, and then on my Kali system, I've configured the proxy to port 9090, and then I'm using Bloodhound as a Python script, having it talk to the domain controller only and collect as much user group domain sessions. Some you won't get session information, but basically collect as much of the core domain information as I can through the DC only switch. Now later, if you decide to be noisier, you can have Bloodhound reach out to individual machines and start collecting local group information and session information. But initially, you probably don't want to do that. Keep it just to the traffic on the domain controller. So what's going to happen there is you're going to fire off a lot of LDAP and ADSI related traffic for that against the domain controller. It's going to pretty much blend. It's normal. It may be a little more. Okay, if you must use the command line, if you're saying, well, man, you know, I really want to see the accounts policy, or I really want to do this specific net command in the environment. Well, there are some workarounds. You can use something like net1. Now, I think, I don't remember where this came from. I know that Sally at Black Hills mentioned this to me at one point, but I'm sure it was discovered by many different groups. There is a binary called net1 on the system that still works to this day on Windows 10. It actually does the same thing as the net command. Well, what if your EDR solutions and your logging solutions are all tuned to looking for net? Net1 might be a simple, effective way to just walk around some of those detections and be able to execute some of your recon and discovery commands. This one I really like. If you have to write to disk, then don't make it too easy for the defenders or any of their solutions, right? Go ahead and encrypt a directory. In environments that are running their own PKI, more than likely the user has a certificate already, and so you can use the cipher command. So one thing I do all the time is I just create a directory. I use cipher/e of that directory, and any artifacts that I'm going to write to disk, I put them in that directory. Now, if you try to access my artifacts as a different user, I didn't get that slide in there, but you're going to get basically that you can't access that file because it's encrypted to that particular user's key, right? So that's kind of a fun thing to do, right? If you have to write artifacts to disk, then, well, just encrypt them. All right, so this presentation wouldn't be any fun if I didn't talk about AMSI, all right? Our friend AMSI has become a pretty effective defense for any of these scripted actions that may occur on a system. The AMSI architecture is going to look at PowerShell. It's going to look at Visual Basic Script. It's going to look at other applications that they can potentially plug in, which includes .NET at 4.8 when you're loading assemblies. And so there are many folks out there that have looked into AMSI bypass, and there are now, in fact, effective AMSI bypasses. If you don't want to execute an AMSI bypass, the anti-malware scan interface, you can always downgrade PowerShell. In some of the environments that I test, this works, where they've left PowerShell version 2 DLLs still on the system. In many of the environments, people have actually fixed that now, and the downgrade tactic is not going to work. Now, the reason you would downgrade PowerShell is because AMSI doesn't exist in PowerShell version 2. It's not going to catch anything. Not only that, you have effectively walked around any of the module logging and the script lock logging if you go down to PowerShell version 2. All right. So again, from a Mitre attack tactical stack perspective, we are talking about defense evasion. We're talking about impairing defenses, disabling and modifying tools, potentially disabling event logging if you've got some even more sophisticated scripts. The way this actually works, if you want to look it up, and this blog is a really, really good read, is you write some code to go through the memory of the current process, looking for the first 24 bytes or so of the machine code that consists of one of the AMSI functions. I don't remember which one it is right now. It might be the scan function. And when you find it, you patch the function by changing the virtual protection on the memory, and you put in a return code that indicates that everything is beautiful. And so whenever the ANSI malware detection routine fires out of AMSI.dll, it simply says, everything's great, nothing to be seen here. By the way, while I was playing with AMSI, I thought I would try some fun tricks. So if you're sitting in PowerShell, you could say, okay, well, what if I just type in a string, invoke Mimikatz? AMSI says, nope, this script is malicious and has been blocked by your antivirus software. I'm so sorry my string offended you, right? What if I take the first 3 or 4 lines of the comments from PowerView.ps1 and paste them into a multi-line string literal in PowerShell? AMSI says, no, I'm having none of that. This is definitely malicious. You are getting blocked, right? So this kind of tells us a little bit of something about AMSI, right? It is scanning string literals for sure. So what if I break this up a little bit? Let me paste Will Schroeder as an author name as a string is will evil. AMSI doesn't think will is evil. Cool. Now let me break that up and paste the second portion. Is the string powersploit file powerview.ps1 evil? Yes, it is. I'm having none of that. Don't you dare try to define a string with the word powerview.ps1 in it, or powersploit file. I don't remember which one was evil. All right, that's kind of fun. So I'm like, I wonder if any of these other things are evil too. So let's take invoke DLL injection and paste that as a literal string. Nope, having none of that. That's evil as well. Okay, let's take author Matt Graber and post that as a string. Nope, Matt's good. Apparently that they're not biased against authors. That's good, I suppose. Now let's take the words invoke DLL injection. No, we're not having any of that. That is clearly bad. All right. So I thought maybe I can get famous. Let's take Joff Thayer and powersploit. And it's like, nope, we're not having any of that. You are clearly malicious, right? So I was like, okay, let's take Joff Thayer and invoke shellcode. And it wasn't having any of that either, right? I tried Joff Thayer by myself, but apparently I'm not malicious, so it's good. I'm good to go. What did this tell me? What this told me is a pretty simple Python script is probably going to be a relatively effective defense against AMSI with respect to PowerShell. All I did, hold on to your beers, is I wrote a script that strips out all comments from any PowerShell script that you feed into it. And it saves a copy called script name -stripped.ps1. Amazingly, or perhaps not so amazingly, you would be interested to learn that this is a pretty effective way to walk right around anything that AMSI is trying to scan. Now, there's some extra features to the PowerStrip script if you're interested in looking at it. One of them is called -s. I call that stutter. And what it does is it actually adds some extra letters into some of the applet names. Kind of fun. So let's keep going on the attacker emulation space. Now let's talk about local escalation. Now, we all know with local escalation, some automation is going to help, right? We need to be able to enumerate whether we have any local escalation opportunities. PowerShell is still useful here. The PowerSploit project is really amazing. So we can go down that road again. We can use PowerUp after we strip it with maybe PowerStrip, and then look for things like writable directories for service executables, spaces and service exe path names, credentials, and so forth, right? Again, from the Mitre a tactical stack perspective, we're talking abusing elevation control mechanisms, perhaps boot or auto start execution. One of the things that PowerUp does is it actually scans for registry keys that are writable as well, right? Hijacking execution flow in the case of DLL hijacking opportunities. Perhaps also in the case of installing an MSI file, an MSI file in the context of an environment that is not going to allow an executable may still be able to be installed and may be a useful execution mechanism. Moving out wider, we go to domain escalation. We have multiple different tactics that we want to use, right? Kerberoasting is a very effective tactic that's been around for quite some time. Again, with Kerberoasting, instead of necessarily extracting the service principal names with something like PowerView on the actual endpoint, why not leverage a proxy, come through the proxy listener, and use a Python script from the Impacket folks called getuserspn.py and extract all those Kerberos tickets basically by proxying the LDAP traffic to get all those SPNs off the domain controller environment, and you have not triggered anything in the endpoint itself because you've already got that listener established and you're simply proxying the traffic through. Password spraying, obviously, another technique. User groups with local administrative access, widespread local admin accounts. It still is a thing, believe it or not. Credentials that are lying around in files. and SMB, authentication, interception, and or relaying. Lots of different ways we can potentially get to domain escalation in an environment. With Kerberoasting, if you are on the system itself, again, you can go down the road of encrypting the directory you're about to write something to, and then after appropriately obfuscating PowerView, you can invoke the Kerberoast function, selecting the hash property out of the object, and then writing the tickets to disk, downloading them, and then extracting them. I typically do not do this as my first tactic. I will go via the proxy, use proxy chains to run the get user SPNs Python script, write all of that out to disk, and then transport those over to a cracking system to be cracked. And this actually, when I am doing an assumed compromise exercise, this is something I do very, very early in the exercise. It is typically something that I'm going to execute right after I establish that initial C2 channel. So right after I get that proxy channel up, I'll extract those tickets, take them over to the cracker, and then set them off and running with a very large dictionary to crack. And then, a day later, after I've done all kinds of other things, come back and go, oh, I've got a domain admin and I didn't even know it, right? Well, not always, right? But sometimes it does happen that way, right? Again, use the proxy. Use the proxy to transport that traffic instead of actually doing it on the endpoint. Password spraying, there's always multiple protocol opportunities with password spraying, right? You've got LDAP authentication, you've got SMB, you've got Kerberos. From an endpoint eventing perspective, using Kerberos tends to be a little stealthier than using traditional SMB/LDAP authentication. And the reason that is a lot of people have instrumented, and they're about to change that if they're listening to this presentation, a lot of people have instrumented their password spraying detections based on the Windows event IDs of 4624 and 4625, right? Hope I got those right. Log on, log off failure. And they're not typically looking at the Kerberos methods, in particular, the Kerberos event ID that fires for a Kerberos authentication failure is going to be 4771, is a Kerberos pre-auth failure. So I tend to go with, these days, using something like Cobalt Strike and or proxying the traffic using something like Kerb Brute or Spray AD, and use only Kerberos PowerShell password spraying so that I avoid the typical detections initially. Okay. One of our favorite techniques in the space as well is to relay SMB. So it is amazing how many times we will find in an environment that the SMB protocol version 1 is still enabled, unfortunately. And if SMB version 1 is still enabled, not only can you potentially intercept it, but you can potentially relay that intercepted traffic to do something else on a target. And the easiest way to do this is to create a shortcut file with a UNC path as an icon, and then place that file on some share in the environment that's commonly visited. Put that as many places as you can, and then you start up some sort of listener in the environment that is listening on TCP 445 for SMB challenge response and anti-challenge response authentication, and you can get a network hash exchange, which you can potentially try to crack, or in the event of SMB one running in the environment and no signing, you can attempt to relay. Okay? If a domain admin happens to surf past your share with your icon file in it, you could relay that to a domain controller and execute a command to fetch all of the hashes, for example, or whatever else you might want to do. Maybe add yourself a local account. So the tools included here, Inve in the PowerShell space, Responder, I think everybody's very well familiar with in the Linuxy space, and then Impacket comes back to play here with NTLM Relay X. where you can actually have an impacted listener in the Linux space. Now, this one is not one that you can easily proxy. You have to have something on the inside of the environment. You must have administrative control over some endpoint on that network to be able to proxy and relay that traffic. With respect to lateral movement, when you're in an environment, a lot of people have tuned their IOCs towards PSExec. Now, if you look at PSExec is really a login over SMB protocol, and then it is the creation of a service which will then immediately execute, and then the service will immediately get deleted. Now, PSExec is going to create a pretty noisy event trail. It's going to create a login event. It's going to create a 7045 service creation event, and then you're going to execute, and hopefully you're going to be able to pivot with it, assuming that you performed all those activities with a locally administrative credential that you've collected. A lot quieter and a lot easier to blend in the environment is to use things like WMI, use things like remote desktop protocol. Yes, I even said remote desktop protocol, and do some things a little bit more manually. If you think about lateral movement, it really is just logging into a system administratively and executing a payload to connect back to your C2 listener, whatever that may be. Now, it may be an internal listener if you don't have internet access, or you don't think you will have internet access from that target endpoint. So you may have an internal pivot being set up. Another thing that's much quieter is to use the distributed component object model, DCOM, and attempt to execute a snippet of PowerShell with DCOM. However, in the DCOM case, when you execute that snippet of PowerShell, instrumentation is probably going to pick you up on the remote system when you do it. Sometimes RDP is best, right? It blends right in. RDP is a protocol, is used all the time. And if you are hunting for credentials, which we often are doing, why not just remote desktop protocol over, right-click on task manager once you run it, find the LSAS process and create a dump file. That's a very normal thing to do. Well, maybe not to create the dump file, but it's a normal Windows kind of action to be on remote desktop protocol. Then the only thing you need to do is get that dump file back off the network somehow. So you have to copy it back to your system, download it, and then you can run Mimikatz offline. WMIC is incredibly useful in tests. From an eventing perspective, WMIC typically does not produce many events. So I like to use WMIC or Windows Management Instrumentation as much as I can. So let's say I have a domain administrative credential and I want a full copy of the Active Directory from a domain controller. Well, it's nicer if I just go ahead and open up a cmd.exe as that user, or I make a token across my C2 channel as that user, and then use WMIC to go across to the node to create an NTDS-util full backup of the Active Directory, and then copy that stuff over to my local system and download it. Or if I'm trying to pivot, combine my living off the land technique by going over to that node, creating an instance of InstallUtil, pointing at my custom DLL that I've compiled, executing my pivot, and getting myself that C2 channel on the remote system. A traditional pivot using things like the Metasploit project or Cobalt Strike is going to try to create an executable file and put it on that system at the other end. If you're in an environment where they are not allowing you to run random executable files or any executable file that is not approved, that's not going to work. So don't bother trying it initially, right? Now, all of these techniques I'm talking about doing in an advanced environment are awesome as a starting point, but as you are trying to emulate your threat actor, you need to dial up the noise as you go. So after you gain some success, and I always like to try to gain some success early, come back and try a traditional pivot using an executable file so that you can fire off some alerts and give the blue team a little bit to smile about, right? So let's not be too mean, right? I'm only partially joking. A well-instrumented, well-defended environment, they are going to see a lot of these techniques but not necessarily all of them. So to summarize this whole talk up, try to stay away from executing things on the actual endpoint if you're in that offensive situation of a well-instrumented, mature environment. After the C2 is established, you've got to have at least that much. Don't use a stager. Stageless for the win. Avoid PowerShell as much as you can. Leverage proxies wherever possible. Leverage intermediaries for your traffic, like CloudFront, to hide your C2 traffic. If you do all these things, EDR probably is not going to get you outside of that initial C2 context. User behavioral analytics solutions, however, are going to see that traffic and probably will trigger. I've got to give Microsoft some credit here. If you look at a Microsoft ATA, those guys will trigger on a lot of this behavior, and they've done a good job, right? And then after a period of time, come back and start doing some of these other techniques that are not quite as sophisticated to give yourself some coverage, doing the sort of repeating those threat emulation tactics and raising the noise level to find out when the blue team actually comes at you and says, hey, you know, I can really see you now. You did this, this, and this, right? And do it all in a loving, respectful, knowledgeable, cooperative manner, and everything is going to be beautiful. That is the end of my talk. It is 2:47. I am 2 minutes over. I am going to go to questions. Let's see if I can find Discord.
You are fine. That was awesome. I loved at the end, right, where you mentioned you try to gain the objective early on so that you can then spend some of the time, kind of triggering and being more noisy and kind of figuring out where the organization is and how you can provide the most value, which is extremely important, right? Like all this fun bypasses and everything. It's not just to like own and win, it's to bring value, right? And I'm glad you mentioned that.
No, you cannot forget that if you're in a threat emulation situation, yeah, you can start quiet, you can bring everything you've got, but you do need to bring back other techniques as well, right? To make sure that people can see what their instrumentation is actually catching, what they can measure and observe, and then have the discussion. The Kerberos pre-authentication stuff I mentioned, I've had discussions with my customers and helped them tune as a post-mortem their password spraying detection for that particular technique, right? So, that's a real big positive because they get a win out of it. It's like you gave me another way that password spraying might come at me, and now I can tune for it and actually be able to detect it, right?
And I also think that there's a huge amount of confirmation that certain tools are working too, because it's not just about the security vulnerabilities, but it's also getting information about what is working too.
Yeah, absolutely. And notice, in the presentation, I'm not trying to say that everything I'm going to do on one of these tests is not going to be seen. It's going to be seen. Now, I think my viewpoint is a little biased. So I'll be frank. Heather, who's our PM, shout out to Heather. She gives me the engagements that make me have to work really hard.
Yep.
So, my viewpoint is being biased by those environments that are really well tuned. And so I think I've got a lot to contribute, and that's what I'm here to present today for exactly that reason, right?
Well, and the other reason why we do this is we would like to see the stuff that you're talking about stop working at some point, right? We would like to see a progression.
Yep. All right. Well, there's my show. We cannot hear you, George.
I just realized that. I tried to talk with you, and I was muted. Now you can hear me. The only question here that I think was a little bit relevant to this, obviously everyone's saying your talks are awesome, which we knew, was what do you think and what have you used and what is your current level of, I guess, detection by default on things like unmanaged PowerShell, like PowerPick?
So PowerPick, for example, I'll pick on that one specifically. Be careful. Something I did not mention specifically with Cobalt Strike is if you use it out of the box and you do not generate your own malleable C2 profile, you will get busted immediately. All of the vendors rightfully have looked at default configuration and made sure to account for that from a defensive perspective.
Yeah.
All right. So PowerPick specifically, do your research. PowerPick will inject into a process of your choosing. It will create a PowerShell run space and execute that script inside of that process space. I have been busted and caught not because of the injection, but because there's another technique that PowerPick in particular uses, and that is to create a local downloader on the host and download the script from localhost as a part of that process. And the reason they do that is there is a command line limitation to how much text you can put into a PowerShell single command line with something like an base64 encoded script. I think it's 8K if I remember correctly. So this download mechanism is built into Cobalt Strike and probably a lot of other tools. What you will run into, though, in a well-tuned environment is they'll have tuned their AV or other detections to look for the creation of an unprivileged port, WebTLS downloader, and they will fire an alert on it.